One look at the name at the bottom of the letter left me briefly spinning. Galgard Nash Venik, commander of the Missionary Knights. I said it to myself a few times. Then I said it slightly differently. Galgard Nash. Shorten that, and you got Gash, which meant Ruijerd's old acquaintance, Gash Broche, was almost certainly named Galgard Nash something or other, and had introduced himself to a superd using a nickname, which was either endearing or deeply suspicious, depending on how you felt about people who did that. The Broche remained unexplained. 40 years was a long time. Maybe he'd married into a different family. Maybe Ruijerd had misheard him. Either way, commander of the Missionary Knights, one of the church's 3 holy military orders. The man whose letter we'd just handed to Duke Bakshiel, who had torn it open, read it, and declared it an obvious forgery. I stepped forward. In other words, you believe this letter to be a forgery, sir? Who are you supposed to be? Bakshiel looked at me the way people look at furniture that has started talking. I don't have time to prattle with children. This was a genuinely novel experience. When I wanted to be treated like a child, people treated me like an adult. When I wanted to be taken seriously, I got this. The universe had a consistent sense of humor. I put one hand to my chest and bowed in the Asuran style, right hand flat, head lowered to a precise angle, weight balanced, nothing rushed. In Asura, the bow itself was a statement. Too deep, and you were supplicating. Too shallow, and you were being rude. This angle said, I am being courteous to someone whose rank I acknowledge, while not forgetting that I have rank of my own. My apologies, sir. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rudeus Greyrat. Bakshiel's brow twitched slightly. Rudeus, Greyrat, you say? That's correct. While I blush to admit it, I am a small, unworthy part of the same Greyrat clan counted among Asura's high nobility. He was recalibrating. But the Greyrat families use the names of the ancient wind gods to distinguish themselves, do they not? That is true, sir. I belong to a branch family, and therefore have no right to use one. The moment the words branch family left my mouth, I watched the caution in his eyes shift to disdain, exactly as I'd intended. A branch family member was useful for establishing the connection, insufficiently threatening to provoke real hostility. Before he could dismiss me. However, the young lady beside me is a true-born member of the Boreas Greyrat family. I clapped Eris lightly on the back. She blinked. Her first instinct was the cross-armed, shoulder-width stance she used when sizing up an enemy. She caught herself. Her second instinct was to reach for the hem of a skirt. She wasn't wearing one. She settled on putting her hand to her chest and bowing, as I had, which was technically correct, but executed with the stiffness of someone reading from a manual they'd skimmed once. I am Eris Boreas Greyrat, daughter of Philip Boreas Greyrat. A pleasure to acquaint you, sir. Her delivery was a little stiff. Also, I felt like she'd messed up the last bit. But we were committed. Bakshiel studied her. The tanned arms, the muscle, the weapon at her hip. His expression curdled. And what is the daughter of an Asuran noble doing here dressed like this? We explained. Fitoa region calamity. Teleported to the demon continent. Crossed it with Ruijerd as our hired bodyguard. When crossing to Milis, we'd sold everything to fund the voyage, but the fees for Ruijerd's passage to Asura were beyond us. Galgard was both a family acquaintance of the Greyrats and a personal friend of Ruijerd's, and had been kind enough to provide a letter. The young lady is dressed as an adventurer solely because we didn't want ruffians realizing she was of noble birth, I added. The potential dangers of a young noblewoman traveling in her finery should be apparent, Duke Bakshiel. I see, said Bakshiel, in a tone that communicated the complete opposite. So that's how it is. You're in league with that Fitoa search and rescue squad that's been causing no end of trouble in Milishian, are you? I've never heard the name Eris Boreas Greyrat. He snorted. I have, however, heard of a certain Paul Greyrat, a thuggish little man who's taken to stealing slaves by force. I took a breath. The feet are a separate issue. Defending Paul Greyrat to Duke Bakshiel was unreasonable, unavoidable, and would accomplish nothing. I did it anyway. Paul Greyrat is trying his best under difficult circumstances. He has flaws, his methods are sometimes imperfect, but worthless. That's a word I find offensive, sir. He is the father of the young lady standing next to me, and he is working to find their missing family. That counts for something. Bakshiel absorbed this without any visible effect. May I ask why you concluded the seal on our letter is inauthentic? It's not uncommon for forgeries of the Missionary Knights' birth seal to circulate on the black market. And why do you believe Lady Eris is not who she claims to be? Pa, he waved a hand. Did you really expect me to believe this rustic boor of a swordswoman was the daughter of an Asuran noble? Eris had assumed her default arms-crossed pose and was radiating hostility in all directions. She looked, objectively, like someone who had spent the past year on the demon continent killing things for money. This was because she had. Ah, I said. It appears you're not familiar with Saurus, then. Saurus? You mean the lord of the Fitoa region? I do. He's also Eris' grandfather, and the man who chose to develop her talents with the sword from a young age. I paused. This next part was either very clever or extremely stupid, and I'd been going back and forth on it since we left the waiting room. This is something of a family secret, but it was decided some time ago that Lady Eris would marry into the Notos family. Saurus detests the current head of that house. I let the implications sit there. Eris looked puzzled. Puzzled was ideal. Understanding would have cost me teeth. If you insist Lady Eris is an imposter, I continued, we'll simply have to turn back to Militian and file an appeal with the appropriate authorities. I had absolutely no idea who those authorities would be, but I said it with the confidence of someone who had a very specific plan, and sometimes that's enough. Look, Duke Bakshiel. I was running out of organized arguments and starting to improvise. Do you really want to make an enemy of the Asuran Greyrat family? The threat came out more boldly than I'd intended. Bakshiel glared at me with something that was almost genuine anger, but his eyes, I noticed, had stopped being contemptuous and started being calculating. Very well, he said, like a man laying down a hand he'd never wanted. I'll permit you and the young lady to book passage. Our guard. By my authority as a duke, I'll assign a few knights to escort you. Surely that would be preferable to the protection of this demon. He was still going to block Ruijerd. I was working out what to do about this when there was a sharp knock at the door, and without waiting for an answer, a blonde woman in cerulean blue armor stepped into the room. My chest seized. My voice came out before I could stop it. Mother? The woman stared at me. I'm a single woman. I have no children. I looked more carefully. The facial structure was very slightly different. The hair color was close, but not identical. I'd been away from home for years. My memory wasn't perfect. I'm sorry. My mother is missing. You look a great deal like her. She absorbed this with the composure of someone who had decided to give me the benefit of the doubt. Captain of the Temple Knights, demoted for losing her unit, said Bakshiel. If you're here about the supered, a team of 2 leaders must oversee every customs post. Ironclad rule, Duke Bakshiel. Shall I explain why you're the only senior officer I see in this room? The Duke went slightly pale. Tell me what's being discussed here. He summarized. She listened. When she turned to study our party, she lingered on Ruijerd with narrowed eyes, softened when she looked at Eris, and then met my gaze. Young man, you thought I was your mother. Her name? Zenith. Zenith Greyrat. I watched the information land. She put a hand to her chin. And your father? I glanced at Bakshiel. Paul Greyrat. The Duke's eyes went wide. I was already rehearsing the explanation in my head. Totally different Paul. Mine is basically a saint, will accept punches and return cash. But I didn't need it, because the woman was suddenly crouching in front of me, and then her arms were around me. I can't imagine what you've been through. This was unexpected. She was in full plate armor, so the embrace was less comfortable than it might have been. But there was a feminine fragrance underneath the metal, and I noted with some detachment that my body was not reacting to it. This was interesting. Zenith had never triggered anything either. Norn, obviously, nothing. Maybe proximity to the genetic source activated some kind of biological override. Or maybe I just had adequate moral architecture. This boy is my nephew, the woman said, over my head to Bakshiel. Thérèse Latria, 4th daughter of Count Latria, and Zenith Greyrat's sister. Bakshiel's face went through several phases before settling on resigned. He sighed and waived the fees for our passage. At an inn in Westport, Thérèse sat behind me on the bed, arms around my shoulders, nuzzling the back of my neck and declaring me adorable at regular intervals. Eris sat across the room with her chin in her hand, drumming her fingers on the table, radiating the specific energy of a person who is counting down from 10 and knows they won't make it to 3. "You're definitely cuter when you stay quiet," said Therese, covering my mouth after a joke that apparently reminded her too much of Paul. Anyway, Commander Gash never changes. He must have known exactly how Bakshiel would react to a letter like that, and wrote it anyway. This opened into an explanation of Galgard Nash Venik that I found genuinely impressive. He'd survived a disastrous expedition to the Demon Continent as a young knight, the kind that shouldn't have had survivors, and had spent the decades since rebuilding the Missionary Knights into the strongest force the Order had ever seen. Under his command, the casualty rate had dropped to below 10%. Every young knight in the 3 holy military orders who made it home from their first campaign owed the shape of their survival partly to his methods. The entire institution respected him. He was also, apparently, nearly incapable of written communication. He rubber-stamped other people's reports. He rarely returned greetings. He had so few known writing samples that forged documents in his name circulated freely on the black market, which was precisely why Bakshiel had assumed our letter was fake. The man who'd written it was famous for never writing. Yet he wrote it for a superd, I said. Ruijerd must have made quite an impression 40 years ago. Therese sounded thoughtful. "Okay," said Eris. "Are you ever going to let go of him?" "Come here, Rudeus." I sat down next to Eris. She immediately grabbed my hand. Within seconds she was blushing to the tips of her ears, staring forward at nothing, jaws set with the specific determination of a person who has done something embarrassing and has decided not to acknowledge it. I found this very charming. Behind us, Therese punched a pillow. "Enjoy your youth while you can." She shook her head, then looked at us more seriously. "There's one thing I need to warn you about before you leave Millis." She paused. "Don't say the word supered within this country's borders." The Temple Knights held an old church doctrine that called for the total expulsion of demonkind from the Millis continent. Most people treated it as a dead letter. The Temple Knights did not. If word spread that a supered was moving through Millis, they would come, even knowing they couldn't win. Therese had made an exception because of everything Ruijerd had done for us. She was being honest about what an exception it was. "You'd never beat Ruijerd in a million years," said Eris coldly. "You're probably right, Miss Eris," said Therese. "We'd fight the battle anyway." I thought about that for a while after we left. The sea crossing went smoothly. Therese had provided seasickness medicine, which meant Eris spent the voyage mildly uncomfortable rather than completely miserable. The difference was significant. She stayed close to me the whole time, which I didn't mind at all. A sailor made a comment about lovebirds and weddings. I put my arm around Eris's shoulders and said, "You bet," with a grin. She punched me in the face. Her expression afterward, while she turned away and refused to meet my eyes, was not entirely displeased. I thought, as the Millis continent shrank behind us, about everyone who was still missing. Zenith, Lilia, Aisha, Sylphie, Ghislaine. I didn't know if Philip and Saros had made it back or what would be waiting for them if they had. Paul's warning about political consequences had stuck with me. I couldn't let it spiral into paralysis. We were moving. That was enough for now. Roxy Magurdia. Roxy's hometown looked exactly as she'd left it. The Migurd village was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a place at rest, but the particular silence of a community that didn't need sound. Everyone she'd grown up with was standing around looking at her, their mouths closed, their thoughts moving through frequencies she couldn't access. She could feel it, the way you feel a sound that's just below hearing, a texture without content. She caught nothing. Her parents appeared. They welcomed her with spoken words, the awkward register of people who were translating from their real language into something she could receive. And she felt the translation at every point, the slightly formal syntax, the things left out because they didn't have equivalents, the warmth that were deniably there but arriving through the wrong channel. She stayed 3 days. On the second evening her mother cried, and Roxy found herself holding her without planning to, and her father's arms came around them both, and for a moment the distance closed into something that didn't need words in any direction. She relaxed. Actually relaxed for the first time in a long time. Then she left. The city of Rikarisu, on the demon continent, had confirmed what Roxy had been refusing to admit for several months. She'd passed Rudeus on the road. She'd walked right by him without recognizing him. She'd been searching for her pupil, and her pupil had been 10 meters away at some point, and neither of them had known it, because she'd been looking for a child, and he'd become something else entirely. The dead-end incident at Rikarisu. A monster that had killed a B-ranked party, Blaze's party, Super Blazers, which was an embarrassing name, and she felt bad thinking so given that Blaze was dead now, swallowed whole by a red hood cobra, and then been killed in turn by a newly formed party of 3, one of whom was a boy who matched every description of Rudeus she'd been collecting for months. The kennel master of Dead End. She'd been assembling this puzzle for a long time, and had known the answer for at least half of it. She just refused to look at it directly. Nokapara, sitting across from her in a Rikarisu bar, confirmed everything. He'd seen Rudeus, described him accurately, looked at Roxy with the expression of someone who'd been wondering when she'd admit it. "You've changed," he said. "Have I?" "Yeah, you used to be desperate for everyone to think you were a grown-up. Now you just are." Roxy thought about this. Out on the demon continent, she kept running into people who'd heard that Rudeus Greyrat studied under Roxy Magurdia and assumed, therefore, that Roxy must be capable of silent spellcasting. They were always surprised when they found out she wasn't. Her pupil had exceeded her in the most technically demanding aspect of magical practice, and he kept telling people it was because of her teaching, which was generous and inaccurate, and had permanently distorted her reputation in a direction she didn't deserve. It was, she'd decided, an oddly specific kind of humiliation to be more famous than you were capable of being. It was also a strange kind of pride. She didn't go to Militian. She told herself it was because the northwest region of the demon continent still needed to be searched. And this was true. Talhand and Elinalise gave each other a knowing look that she chose not to interrogate. The real reason, which she acknowledged fully and privately and intended never to say aloud, was that she had literally walked past her own pupil on a road without recognizing him, and she was not ready to explain that. She was still his master. The master's dignity had to be preserved, even at some distance. 2 months after leaving Westport, we arrived at Eastport, in the Dragon King realm. It was the largest port city in the world, and it looked approximately like every other large port city I'd seen, which was becoming a pattern. Eris picked up a smell about 100 meters from the harbour. "Something smells good," I sniffed. Then I stopped walking. There was something familiar in that aroma. Not familiar in the sense of having smelled it recently, but familiar in a way that bypassed rational processing and went somewhere older. I walked toward it without consciously deciding to. The restaurant at the source of the smell was a genuine disaster, crumbling brickwork, a sign so weathered as to be unreadable, a front door that had been resenting its hinges for decades. Ruijerd, who had spent 400 years watching things fall apart, gave it a look of professional assessment. "Don't you usually prefer more visually appealing restaurants?" "Change of pace," I said. Inside, 2 tables, several chairs missing legs, holes in the floorboards. No other customers at noon. A skeleton-thin man emerged from the kitchen with the expression of someone who had given up hope some time ago, but was still going through the motions out of habit. "Welcome, folks." The menu had 2 items, dragon meat, Nanahoshi style, and alba fish stew. Nanahoshi was a word I had never heard in this world. It meant 7 stars in Japanese. I was looking at it very carefully. When it arrived, I had to grip the table. There was a clear vegetable soup, simple, clean, would complement a grain well. There were deep-fried chunks of something. And there was, in a bowl in the center, something that was not quite white rice, but was unambiguously rice. Multigrain, mixed with other things, the color slightly off, but rice. Real rice. In this world. "Rudeus?" Eris was watching me with concern. "It's nothing." I shoveled a forkful into my mouth. In my previous life, I had eaten rice every single day. I had eaten the finest rice Japan produced, carefully graded and properly stored and served at ideal temperature. Under any objective standard, this was not good rice. It was mediocre grain improperly combined with other things and cooked by someone who didn't know what they had. And yet, I cried. Quietly, but I cried. 1 tear, possibly 2. This was rice, actual rice. It had been years. For the first time in my life, I understood with my entire being that all rice was created equal. All rice is beautiful, I said to no one in particular. Then I tried the carrage. It was not carrage. The coating was wet and oily. The interior was dry and tough. The longer I chewed, the more aggressively it smelled. It was, from a culinary standpoint, a declaration of war against the rice sitting next to it. It was also a declaration of war against the concept of deep frying, against protein, against me personally. I asked to see the chef. What followed was not my finest moment. In my defense, I had just cried over rice. My emotional state was not stable. I said things to that skeletal man about his courage that I would not be proud of in retrospect, including detailed technical commentary on his oil temperature, his moisture-trapping technique, his choice of meat, and the fundamental question of whether someone who made courage this bad had any right to put it next to rice. Eris and Ruijerd dragged me out. Randolph. The boy had been absolutely right about everything. The oil wasn't hot enough. He hadn't known to trap moisture before coating. He'd used dragon meat because dragon had been this restaurant's signature dish for 250 years, and that had been correct once, in the era when his great-great-grandmother had sourced her meat from a specific region, aged it a specific way, and used a seasoning combination she'd taken to her grave. What he'd inherited was the name and the form. What he'd lost was everything that made the form worth the name. Chagall leaned back in his chair with the tolerant expression of a man who had been patient for years and was prepared to be patient for a few more minutes. I think this ought to make things crystal clear, don't you? Your cooking's lousy enough that a child can shred it. Come work for me. Dragon has been the backbone of this menu for 250 years, you've told me, and the last person who made it correctly has been dead for 3 generations. Chagall's voice didn't change. You've got real skills in a different field. Everyone has jobs they're better suited to. Randolph stared at his hands, thought about the rice, which the boy had genuinely wept over, thought about the soup, which apparently had been good, thought about the carrage, which had not been. All right, he said, I'll close it down. He would carry the disgrace. That was simply what it was. On that day, High General Chagall Gargantis of the King Dragon Realm completed a recruitment he'd been attempting for years. Randolph Marianne, known in certain circles as the Death God, ranked 4th among the 7 great powers. The reason he'd finally agreed, after so many refusals, would never be widely known. What was known was that a certain 11-year-old boy's unhinged culinary critique, delivered with the passion of someone whose rice had been personally insulted, had been the final catalyst. Dead end, inadvertent destabilizer of regional power structures since formation. Filed intelligence summary, Princess Ariel, excerpted from the personal records of Gustav, information broker, Ars. While we were crossing the sea, a man named Gustav, professional information broker, capital of the Kingdom of Asuran, was earning a very good fee to answer a simple question. Was second Princess Ariel Anamoy Asuran dead or alive? Gustav had a policy against getting involved in noble faction politics. The policy had lasted until the money arrived. The background: Ariel had left Ars with 17 retainers, ostensibly to enroll at the Ranoa University of Magic. The rumor of her assassination was spreading with suspicious speed and suspicious anonymity. Her own faction, Pilamon Notos Greyrat's people, had lost contact with her entirely and were paying Gustav to tell them what their own allies couldn't. Gustav followed her trail north. At the border checkpoint, a control officer named Smealy Gatlin had received direct orders to delay her and let her through anyway. The garrison soldiers cheered. Gustav noted this as subject commands irrational loyalty in people who have met her once. North of the border, in the forest known as the Wyrm's Whiskers, a solo merchant named Bruno had witnessed the ambush. 7 black-clad assassins against 4 guards and a white-haired boy, Silent Fitz, matching description, who ran the battlefield with awareness Bruno called Sword Sanctum level, held the line. almost held the whole thing. Almost. The last assassin cut a girl's head off. That assassin was killed half a second later. Gustav delivered his conclusion. Princess Ariel was dead. He was wrong. The Asuran royal family owned implements capable of producing a perfect body double. The girl Bruno watched die was a stand-in. The checkpoint's lookout tower, equipped with a long-range observation implement, had watched the real Ariel emerge from the forest on the north side. Gustav found out in his favorite bar. From a conversation he overheard while his dinner was sitting in front of him, and a bottle of rare Northern Territories liquor was open beside it. He put this information in a mental column labeled Things to Act On, and poured himself a drink. As a direct result, Pileman Notos Greyrat, the ranking member of the Ariel faction, acted on faulty data, made a painful decision, and ended up in a predicament that would take years to fully resolve. Gustav's professional assessment of his own performance, recorded in his notes. Even a clever boy overlooks a few things now and again. We naturally knew none of this at the time. We were on a boat arguing about rice.